My name is Rick Alexander, and you're listening to Lionheart Radio. Hey everyone, as promised, today's show is part 2 of yesterday's episode with Rob Wilson, owner of CrossFit Virginia Beach, coach at The Art of Breath. Today we get into his new program and how we're going to use metrics to actually measure our rate of perceived exertion, which in the past has always been left up to individual athletes' subjectivity. And I think what's really cool is Rob has a way to take that subjectivity out of it. So you guys enjoy today's show with Rob Wilson. I'm a believer in the breath work. The reason I even came to the seminar in the first place was because I had Brian McKenzie on the show, randomly brought it up. I really wasn't even kind of following it. He brought it up. I started putting it in my training. It saved my ass in Tahoe. So then I just became a believer and I came to the seminar and I really use it a lot now. One of the things I struggle with though is I'm always trying to measure output in some way so that I know whether I'm progressing or whether I'm deloading as far as volume goes. But I have trouble quantifying some of the breath work and where does that fall into, like, for example, what's the bang for my buck when I'm doing breath work? How do I quantify that so I know whether I'm progressing and I'm adding it into these other things that I'm doing? So as I understand it now, you're kind of developing a system to measure that and quantify that?
Yeah, so, up to recently when we would try to teach people, especially about breath work in specific relevance to intra performance use.
Yep.
Creating language around that was a little bit difficult, right? So it's easy to give someone a protocol when they're doing like a formal practice, like, in for 10, hold for 10, out for 20, hold for 10, right? That's a pretty easy thing to communicate. Okay, only use your nose, right? But when somebody's in the midst of work, we would say something like, okay, during this part, like nasal, because nasal does this, and then you could switch to your mouth, and it becomes kind of this like ball of yarn that can be difficult to untangle in the moment, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're also trying to focus on like the actual skill of the activity that you're engaged in, and
sure. Not
to mention if you're competing. So what we've been trying to wrap our heads around is creating a language that would describe how I would have a metric for where I am in my level of output relevant to my energy system, and then 2, attach a language to it so it's easy to communicate what I want and so I can change that in real time, whether it's for me personally or if I'm working with an athlete. And the analogy that we came up with that felt like we're the best up till now, for now is gears, like in a transmission.
Okay.
Right? And so that came because a lot of people describe their capacity as their engine, right? And so we have 5 gears that we've described so far. So a first gear would be like a nasal only, like a smooth, even cadence. Second gear would be a nasal only with an emphasized inhale, mm-hmm. right, to start sort of delivering higher volumes of oxygen to the system. Then an emphasized exhale. Then there's a 4th gear where we start to use the mouth. And then a 5th gear where basically we're near exhaustion and it's just like winner take all.
Yeah.
Breathing however I can. And that's usually seldom or after for like short-term recovery, right? And if I understand these gear systems and I can attach them to certain levels of output, then it's easy for me to communicate what I want, how I want you to approach a workout. So for example, if I want an athlete to stay focused on developing sort of their low-level aerobic base, right? So if I'm dealing with a power athlete, and I just need them to develop some like low heart rate, low level aerobic capacity. I can be like, hey, you need to get on a bike and you're going to bike for 20 minutes and you're going to stay in first gear. And that basically means everything's in the nose, smooth in, smooth out, no less than 5 breaths per second, 1 breath per 5 seconds. So about 2 or 3 seconds in, 2 or 3 seconds out. And that generally keeps people at a relatively low level.
Relative to you, because your second and my second might be different.
Exactly. And the way that we tend to think about this is, right, so if you look at like a Volkswagen Bug and you look at a Ferrari F50 in first gear, The Volkswagen goes about 16 miles an hour in first gear. Ferrari goes about 61 miles an hour in first gear.
Yeah.
But they both have first gear.
Right.
And you have to pass through first gear to get second gear. Right. And that's the idea, is to know what gear I'm in. Right. And to make sure that the speed that I want to go matches my gear. And these are completely based on physiological metrics. Right. So once I have to start basically breathing out with my mouth, I know I'm offloading CO2 at a high rate. Now, this is valuable if I'm engaged in an activity that creates a lot of metabolic waste, right? So that's our fourth gear.
Like sprint work or something like that.
Sprint work, something like that. Like if you can sprint while you're only breathing with your nose, you're probably not sprinting.
Right.
Right?
Right.
You're probably not, because let's face it, if you have a very high power demand,
The demand for oxygen
can't be processed fast enough to make ATP to be that explosive, that fast, right?
Sure.
However, being efficient with oxygen helps us reconvert other energy sources into usable fuel for power. So it's really important. So in any case, the idea with the gear system is so that when I'm in the midst of a training session, I know, okay, well, I want to be in first gear, second gear, third gear, and to be able to up and downshift during training evolutions based on the feedback I'm getting from my system and based on the level of output that I'm getting. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And not only that, but to be able to match breath rhythms and cadences with movement patterns so that I can basically continuously be focused on the rhythm of the movement and getting enough air in and out of the system, either for the purpose of ventilation, like getting air in and out, or for the purpose of stability, right, which is also really important. And what we found is that up to this point, there's no language around this, right? So again, I could just say like, okay, well, on this next 400 meter run, I want you to inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. But it was kind of vague exactly what was meant. And so in this program that we created, I can just say, hey, on your first 200, I want you in first gear. In your recovery, I want you in first gear. Then I want you to move into your 400 repeats. You're going to do 4 total 400 repeats. The first 2 I want in third gear with a second gear recovery. Then I want you in fourth gear for the second 2, and I want you to shift into these recovery strategies. And what that helps you do is start to learn how to move up and down the breath continuum so that you can recover your capacity and have more predictable levels of output, but with a really easily mental label for what it is you're doing, instead of like in my I'm like trying to remember. You can just go, oh, that's right, this is fourth gear. And in the program, we take you through several different types of training evolutions. So anybody who uses it has an opportunity to actually try it, practice it, and develop a relationship with it. And then over time, realizing like, even if you start out as a Volkswagen and you end up a Ferrari over training, that you're still going to have these sort of gears available where, okay, well, if I'm in a race, I don't want to run in fourth gear the whole time because I'm going to burn myself out, right? Because I'm operating at a level where I have a lot of waste that I have to deal with in the system. But kind of like we talked about earlier with the barista, she was technically breathing in what we would call fifth gear, like hyperventilation. How much energy is she using up to make coffee? Right. And by the same token, you see people who start races and they're going already, which is very energy inefficient. But if you can say, okay, from now on, when you start, I want you to be in first gear through that whole first piece. And then when you find like somebody who either through training or natural inclination is good at hills climbing, you can go, hey, when you get to the hill, fourth gear, make some passes. All right, now when you come back down the other side, drop it in third. By the time you get to the bottom, you should be in second, and then hold second through that next phase so that you can keep your lead, right? And so now we have a language that makes it easy for me to understand where I should be. And then if you're a coach, will make it easy to communicate with athletes
Yeah.
about the level of output that's based on their actual ability to control their breath, which is a direct reach into their real-time physiology and doesn't depend on like calibration of a wearable or what's my sympathetic tone and it's like it's real time.
Mm-hmm.
I can up and down shift as I feel necessary while I'm actually performing.
So what's cool about that is in the past we've used rate of perceived exertion, and that is a really hard. Like I find with my athletes, I'm constantly getting questions like, well, what's 70%? What's 80%?
Exactly.
And so you kind of come up with these things. It's like, okay, well, if you're holding an aerobic pace and you can hold a conversation, then maybe you're around like 65%, or you try to come up with different metrics. So I like this idea of really standardizing it based on your breath, so that it's subjective to them because can't really fuck with the breath. And then you have that language, like you said.
Right. And we have metrics too. So, it's not just like, hey, we're guessing,
Mm-hmm.
but also we have metrics that will say, hey, what's your output in first gear? What's your output in second gear? And then over time, because like we talked about earlier, it is important to have some data over time as you're continuously testing people, throughout their training cycle. You can go, okay, well, actually so-and-so is capable of going much faster in first gear now. And so there is some nuance in there for sure. And we actually have this concept of what we call push, right? And first gear push, I think about it like this in terms of a transmission rate when your RPMs are high. Like, so you hear the engine, and it's right before you either have to slow down or shift into the next gear.
Yeah.
And so that idea of being able to rev up and then I've changed my breathing in a way that allows me to maintain that same pace without having to back off or burn myself. I can go, oh, nope, I feel those RPMs going up, and I know that either I'm going too fast, I can't sustain it, or I have to start dealing with a buildup of waste in the system in an organized way. And I think that's a really important skill for athletes to have. And right now, we just kind of hope that our training will do it. We just sort of train harder.
Yeah.
Like, I need to spend more time in these sort of windows of training.
Yeah.
Which is very indirect, So we tend to think like, well, if I spend X amount of time continuously training in one evolution, that automatically I'm training a certain system. But the reality is that's another correlate, right? Like, our body doesn't have a clock like that. It doesn't go, 20 minutes, that's aerobic. Right. There's always this interplay going on in the energy system.
Yeah, and you're switching back and forth.
But if I make you only breathe with your nose, that's aerobic. No doubt.
Right. And so when you talk about metrics, is it specific to, do you have different metrics for different sports, right? Because it almost has to be. So the amount of CrossFitters that I've seen, do Fran and forget to breathe in the first set of 21 thrusters and then just really smash the wall. It's not that 21 thrusters cooked them. It's that they didn't breathe for 21 straight thrusters, or they had very shallow, rapid breathing. So they weren't able to process oxygen. So are these metrics different?
Yeah, so one that we use is actually a variation on the Konkani test. So, if you're familiar with the Konkani test, they use it a lot in cycling, which is basically an on-the-minute rev up in wattage or RPMs, depending on the device that you're using.
Yeah.
With they use heart rate, and sometimes we'll use heart rate as one variable. But with the adaptation that we've created to the test, we basically see where people start to change gears. So where do they start to? When can they no longer breathe evenly? When do they have to switch to their mouth? When does their output start to drop off? And we keep sort of track of how their wattage is affected and where does it correlate to their shifts in breathing patterns.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the big tests that we use. And then one of the other ones is we do a sprint test on a cycle and basically see, can somebody output big in a very short interval and then recover nasal only very rapidly. And I think that's a really good power metric especially for people who are on more power-based sport applications. Can they output really, really high and then boom, drop everything down a gear so that they're able to consistently maintain their level of power output. And I think what happens in power sports a lot is people just like hit it harder, hit it harder, hit it harder, hit it harder. And you see big degradations in skill. And people just sort of hope over time that practice will alleviate that problem, or just exposure. So, I mean, even something as simple as like a heavy double power clean.
Yep.
You watch somebody do that on the minute for 10 minutes. It gets junky about minute 6.
Yeah.
Because, 2 power cleans takes like 10, 12 seconds if it's pretty heavy.
Yep.
What do people do for the rest of that minute that they have? They sort of stand there and feel sorry for themselves.
Yep.
With no thought to how am I going to, in an organized way, recover my energy system so I have available power energetically
again
to deliver again. They'll learn like where to put their feet, where to put their hands, push really hard. They'll do all the other sort of technical aspects, but not the baseline physiological component that governs all of that, which is my ability to get oxygen into the system and process waste.
So that was actually gonna be one of my questions. Is like, what do you think about this idea of people doing, let's say, we'll use 400-meter repeats because we talk about sprinting in 4th gear, because that's probably a 4th, 5th gear type activity, and then the time in between trying to shift down to 2nd.
Yeah, yeah. So that's like one of the exercises that we have people do pretty regularly is, so towards the end of a training session, starting to push, especially, one of the other questions you have to ask is, what is the point of my training session that day?
Right. Context.
And so, context. So if the goal is to develop top end speed in my 400, then I need to push top end speed, right? And so in that case, I'm going to be in probably mostly 4th gear, maybe 5th gear, the last 100, where it's just like everything I've got.
Yeah.
But then immediately, instead of like what most people do is like they hang their head down, they put their hands on their knees, and just sort of let their body suck wind until their coach is like, do it again.
Right.
And they're like, okay. And they just try
hope it's
harder.
There. Yeah.
Right?
Just suffer better.
It's there, suffer better.
Yeah.
Exactly. Instead of, how can I be more precise with the way that I regulate my output? And again, what's really cool about that is, obviously people have been able to perform well, but I think what this allows us to do is predict our outcome a little bit better.
Yeah.
Because we're being more specific about what we're asking an athlete to do. One of the things that has sort of been coming up a lot lately with all of this work is that the human body is self-regulating, but it's not self-optimizing. Right? If it was self-optimizing, there would be no need to train. We could just like go out and run races, and
we'd be optimized to do it
better, and everything would be okay. But obviously, with the advent of more sophisticated training thinking in the last 50 to 100 years, we've seen some continual progress in the ability for human beings to perform sport tasks. Tech has a little bit to do with that. But I think if we can be more precise with our training, 1, we have a higher potential to get more predictable outcomes. But 2, we can use our time more effectively. So, if I have somebody who I'm working with and I can get a more precise aerobic or oxidative input into the system, and it takes less time because we're being more precise, then that's more time they can spend developing the skill of their sport. Right, which is really important. So, especially if you work with recreational people, if I can be really, really precise with how I'm asking the system to adapt, then it doesn't take nearly as many inputs to get a favorable adaptation.
Right. So, is your program, is it the methodology, or is it an actual protocol, an actual like workout routine?
Oh no, it's an actual. It has some overview of the methodology, but the program itself is basically like, so if you bought the program from Power Speed Endurance, you would get some introductory stuff, how the gears work, what they are, practice sheets, and all of that. But then it's basically a spreadsheet, and it's 3 days, 3 days per phase for 4 phases. And I say phase instead of week because I don't like putting a time on something, because I think I like for people to have the freedom to try something longer.
Yeah.
If they're like, I really want to understand this more. But sometimes when you put the parameter of week, people think they get to Friday and then I'm done.
Yeah.
Right. And each phase progressively introduces a concept or helps practice one of the concepts that's integrated in the energy system control program. So, for example, the first couple of days are developing test metrics and then how to use the gears with very simple warm-up exercises. And this is one of the other places that I think our program is really different, is integrating breath protocols into the warm-up in order to prepare the pulmonary system effectively for work. But the first phase is sort of like, hey, let's try this stuff in the warm-up. It's a non-threatening, sort of non-performance iteration. Let's do some tests. And then as the program develops, we start enhancing the level of the stimulus with very specific gear protocols. So we'll say, okay, like we do one called the gear pyramid, where it's basically every gear up to 4th gear, 1 minute in each gear on the erg, and then immediately downshifting right back down. So it teaches you how to sequentially bring things up and then sequentially bring them back down. And so that's sort of like a broad-based exposure. And then as the program gets on, we sort of expose you to odd movement signatures, higher levels of metabolic stress with more severe downshifts. And what we found through our own personal testing is the ability to downshift rapidly once you experiment with these and utilize these concepts for a long time is it's pretty incredible. And a couple weeks ago, I was actually warming up to do the Konkani test myself in the course of researching this program.
Yep.
And I just did like a 20 on, 40 off on the assault bike, kind of climbing, and I had a Polar 7 heart rate monitor on, just to be specific about what I was using, right?
Yep. And
my heart rate is about 152 when I got the bike, and I had basically like an assistant, like somebody who was watching my heart rate for me, because I don't like to look at that stuff while I'm going. And
because of the subjectivity, you don't want it to affect your output.
Exactly.
Okay.
I don't want it to affect my output.
Yep.
So I just work on the time signature that's being asked of me.
Yep.
And then I got off the bike, sat down, and used one of the breathing protocols that we teach in the program, which is a little bit more advanced. It's like a sped up recovery. But I was able to drop my heart rate about 50 beats in 3 breaths. Which I didn't know was possible.
Yeah.
And I probably wouldn't have been able to do it if I saw the heart rate monitor. I only knew because the guy who was helping me out was like, holy shit. And I was like, what? And he told me. And then, of course, my heart rate went right back up because I was like, oh, neat. That's cool. And then it was like, doom. And he was like, yeah, it just went back up 25 beats a minute, But just the ability to
bring it back down,
use your breath to go, whoom,
yeah,
and drop that heart rate that fast. Well, what if I got off the bike, I had 2 minutes of rest before I had to hit it hard again?
Right.
Well, what does that say about a race, right? I'm racing. I finish a stage, if you're doing a stage race and you have some time. Well, if I can drop myself into parasympathetic response fast, then I'm going to enhance my ability to recover. I'm going to save energy, right? So I'm not going to continue to burn at a high level.
Yeah.
I'm going to save energy, and then I'm going to start my next portion of the race far more refreshed with a lot more reserves than if I hadn't been able to do that, right?
And if you're not going to start again, you've started the recovery process way quicker.
Started the recovery process way quicker.
Because I'm thinking about CrossFit, that just instant drop the barbell, lay on my back, and just let my heart blow out of my chest, sitting there, where it's like, if you could bring that back down, that puts you in a way different position.
Totally. Well, and, so CrossFit or really any sport that's tournament based.
Yeah.
Right. So even if you play volleyball, you finish a match. If you can go sit down, you can bring yourself down. Not only would you be recovered sooner, but you would be able to significantly increase your ability to reflect on the performance you just had and learn at a much faster rate. And this is something I've found personally through exploring these concepts through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is that my ability to drop myself down a couple gears between rounds allows me to reflect a lot more rapidly on what just happened. Even though like I'm a nobody white belt, I am learning quickly because I'm not staying in sort of like a hyperventilated, exhausted panic mode as I go into the next round. You can reflect a little bit more quickly. Your whole system comes down, and then you go, okay, what are the couple mistakes I made? I'm going to try not to make those this time. And I start not from like a 1 or 2, right, but at a 3 instead of a 5. And you see a lot when guys sit down and they're still, and they ended their last match 2 minutes ago, and they're still. Now, there's a couple ways you can condition yourself to not have that happen. One is to work super hard and spend a lot of time suffering really hard in the gym. Or you can train super smart, still work hard, but train super smart and learn how to control the gears.
Right.
And me personally, I would much rather have control over gears where I'm basically going from driving an automatic transmission to driving a manual transmission. I'm deciding what the engine is doing rather than just having something happen to me.
Right. You have control over it.
Yeah.
I think what I like the most about this kind of conversation is, the one thing that baristas, jiu-jitsu, endurance athletes, CrossFitters, powerlifters, everybody has in common is the fact that they have to breathe in order to perform their task. And so it just, based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like this program is really, if you're a human being that needs to move, then this program probably has some adaptability to your life.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we're just using training parameters to expose a physiological reality.
Right.
Like these gear systems are a description. And, my hope is to generate a conversation with the broader human performance community about what we can call these things, so we can at least have a more sophisticated discussion. Because my hope is somebody smarter than me will start to use this,
build on it,
and go, well, actually inside first gear, there's like first gear A and there's first gear B, and here's what those actually mean. And then we create a new way to communicate it that's even better. But right now, we can't even talk about it, but now you and I, we know what first gear is. So like if you call me tomorrow, we can go, oh man, okay, so I was doing XYZ in first gear, and I'll know what you mean. Yeah. So, but now when somebody says, well, I was training nasal only, I was doing that workout nasal only, I go, well, was it even inhale, even exhale, nasal only? Was it an explosive exhale where you focused on a full inhale? Like, explain your nasal only to me, because there's a lot of different ways to breathe nasal only.
Right. It's aerobic, but there's...
Exactly. How do I know? Well, and we know like in sort of like second gear push, which is the high end second gear, and third gear, this is where we're starting to transition out of oxidative and more into anaerobic, sort of generally. Yep. But that is a lot of words to describe what is going on, and to try to have that discussion with an athlete, between an athlete and a coach, can be very confusing, and it's hard for an athlete to know what you want them to get out of a session, or what I'm trying to get out of a session.
Especially if it's remote.
Right? Especially if it's remote, right? So now I can go, oh, well, this workout, here's what first gear means. I want you to stay in first gear. And to me, it's pretty analogous. So if anybody's familiar with Dr. Kelly Starrett's work, taking really complicated movement patterns and creating an archetype. Yeah. Right. And of course, there are huge variants from person to person in those archetypes, but it's basically like, hey, can you make a hang shape? Does your arm bend 90 degrees? Do you have, at least 90 degrees of internal rotation and 90 degrees of external rotation? This is a hang shape. That makes it easy for for a coach to go, hey, do you have a hang shape? And to know what that means, and then go, you don't have a hang shape. You need to do this thing. Yeah. Or otherwise, you're going to make significant compromises in your ability to clean. That's really easy to communicate. Sure. Right. But right now, there's energy system chemistry is like super complicated. Yeah. And when I try to explain to somebody who isn't well versed, and I'm not I don't have a biochem degree, right? And so I try to explain to one of my athletes what I'm trying to get them to get out of a workout. The conversation can become so complicated that the intention is diluted.
Yeah.
So I can go, all right, everybody, when I teach a class, all right, this run interval, first gear. Everybody goes, okay. And how fast first gear is for a guy who played collegiate soccer and just transferred to CrossFit is different than like mother of two just recovered from her second baby, her first gear.
Also doing CrossFit. But
they both know what first gear is, and it helps them develop a pacing strategy so that they're both optimizing what they're getting out of that training.
Yeah.
And that's the idea.
Cool. So when people buy this, they get the protocol, and they also get this webinar series as a package.
They can. So the idea will be, when this comes out, which will be in the next week or two, that they'll be sold independently, but there will also be a package option. And so the program itself, I think is going to run about $100.
Okay.
That's 4 phases, and there's plenty of like written and video explanation just in the program. But for people who are nerds like us and want to like deep dive and like, what's the intention behind this and what are we really trying to get? And especially if you're a coach, the webinar is going to have a lot more lengthy explanation of what the variables in the program are, and also some of the more nuanced or more sophisticated ideas around actual application.
Yep.
But if you're just like, just tell me how to breathe when I do this, then you can do the program. You can get an idea of what works for you, and then start implementing it as you see fit.
So we're in your office right now. You're recording the webinars behind us. Yeah. And on your board, you said you have don't get attached and starred. I'm curious, what does that mean in context to this?
So here's the thing, right? Is so like, the tendency is to get attached to your own intellectual property, right?
Yeah.
And that's just as much a reminder for me as it is to the people I'm lecturing, because, what happens is when we have a great idea, we are the ones who think it's great, right?
Yeah.
And often what happens is we become emotionally attached and unscientific about how we're thinking about processes like this. And the reality is I don't have it all figured out. None of us have it all figured out. Right. And the idea is to start using this language as a reference point for what's going on, but not to mistake it for the thing itself. Right. It's kind of like, I always like this old Buddhist saying, it's like a finger pointing to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you miss all the heavenly glory.
Yeah.
So it's like the language is just a tool so we can communicate about it so that we can understand it better. But the language isn't the thing itself.
Yeah.
That my energy system physiology doesn't actually start and stop with the description of these gears. And our expression of nature is far more complex and nuanced than that.
Yeah.
But we have to have language in order to explore ideas and talk about things so that we can make it better. When people apply the programs, it's just like we were talking about earlier with heart rate. People go, oh, well, 160 heart rate, I got 5 more beats a minute and I'm going to blow apart.
Yeah.
And it's like, maybe you are, maybe you're not.
Definitely not if you're telling me.
Definitely not if you're telling me, right?
Right.
And so not to be attached to putting certain values on certain levels of output, but to just use them as frames of reference so that I actually have some arrows pointing me in the direction I want to go.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is the more intelligent you are, the more that seems to be propagated, because you start to believe, and I've seen it within my own life, not that I'm that intelligent, but you start to think that nothing can exist outside of what you already understand. And so then you become kind of closed off to any further evolution, right?
Yeah. All the best coaches that I know and respect, when you ask them a question, their answer usually starts with, it depends.
Yeah.
Right? Because everything is based in context. I mean, I can remember learning martial arts as a kid even, and like my buddies being like, hey, when somebody punches you, what do you do? And it'd be like, well, it depends.
Yeah. Right.
Are they with buddies?
Yeah.
Are you alone? Can you walk away?
Right.
Are you at school?
Yeah.
Tell a teacher? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, I asked my martial arts instructor, well, what happens if this? Well, it depends. What's the energy that they're giving you?
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah, Tony Blauer talked about that a lot when he was on our show. Cool. So I think we'll do the Lionheart Kicker one more time. So this is the final question we try to ask every guest, but if you could give blanket advice, we're guaranteed everybody in the world would hear it, what would you tell people?
Learn and unlearn over and over.
Yeah. What do you mean by unlearn?
Learn something as deeply as you can and then let it go.
Mm.
Right? And just to kind of like tie into the conversation you and I were just having.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to learn something deeply. You know, you can almost always tell what the last book somebody just read is.
Yeah, you definitely
because it's
can.
like what's affecting their belief system right
Yeah.
now. You know, and we all fall into that trap. But I think what's really important is, you know, you learn something, you allow some of the concepts to become integrated into your thinking, but then you realize that before you learned that thing,
Mm-hmm.
you had another concept about the way the world works, and that the real journey is the continual evolution of those concepts and not becoming so bogged down in defending your point of view that it's impossible to grow anymore.
Yeah, it's super hard as a coach to not use what you're using right now as an athlete. If you're both, if you're an athlete and a coach, it's hard, to coach people, especially if you're getting success with something. It's hard to, sometimes you have to step back and be like, well, is this the best thing for all people based on what I already understand, coming up with an amalgamation of those things.
Yeah, and I mean, realizing too that there are no panaceas.
Yeah.
There is nothing that just works for everybody all the time. Like I'm super into the breath work. My wife doesn't do it. I mean, does breath work help her? Would it help her? I mean, she has the same basic physiology that all human beings have.
Mm.
She doesn't want to sit down, though. She's a type A person. She likes to be busy. Her eyeballs open. Her feet hit the floor. She's got shit to do.
Yeah.
And that's totally fine.
Right.
Maybe she'll take one concept and apply it to her training in the way that she finds that will help her, and maybe not. And that's the idea, is just to start to create a toolkit. And that's why I'm so wrapped around the idea of language.
Mm-hmm.
Is because it allows us to become more effective communicators, and then it makes it easier to help people develop a toolkit because I actually have a name for the tool.
Right. Cool. So for people that are listening to this and they want to kind of follow along with you and the stuff you're doing, I know powerspeedendurance.com is where they can buy the program. What other ways is there to follow you and get in touch?
Yeah, so like you said, powerspeedendurance.com/art of breath too. That has all of our upcoming seminar series.
Cool.
You can find me on Instagram at prepare to perform, at powerspeedendurance, and then also at _Brian McKenzie on Instagram as well. It was at I am.
I was going to say, what? No longer I am unscared.
I believe it recently changed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Dude, thanks a lot for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to Lionheart Radio. I hope that the information from today's show will make you fitter, happier, and healthier. For the show notes of this episode and every episode, head to www.lionheartrad.io. Yep, just like Lionheart Radio. And please, if you have the time, head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps us to know that we're on the right track in delivering you reliable information and value. As always, feedback is welcomed. If you have any comments on the show or would like to suggest a guest, send me an email at rick@luavive.com. That's LUAVIVE.com. Thanks for your support, and we will see you next time.
Bitch, I feel good. Don't I look stupendous? My shine is so endless, and shit you can do to end this. Even when I'm dead, niggas still gon' bump that chip shit. Coke, white, Escalade on cinches for you dipshits. So you won't forget this. Midwest nigga be the coldest. Cleveland,